Hello, you're listening to Death by Adaptation podcast, all about. I've reset my brain into going into my podcast intro. This is the podcast where we talk about a book and a film, and we compare the two, we contrast, we communicate the message of a book and a film towards each other, and hopefully to you as well. And if you like that sort of thing, Death by Adaptation is your place. Before we even get into introducing who's hosting and who's here, I'm Ewan Gleadow, by the way. But you can go and subscribe to us, go and listen, give us the 5-star ratings. I've never said any of these words before because I'm not a sellout, but then I remember I worked for Daily Star. So anyway, go and give us the 5 stars. Get us shared on your social medias while that's still around. You know, Twitter's still a thing at the time of recording. But no, give us a like, give us a follow, give us a share, give us a spread. Because this is either the penultimate or the last episode of the year. I don't remember
ultimate
which.
one, yeah.
Penultimate episode, and that voice you just heard there is the wonderful Nicolò Grasso, who usually hosts, but because it's music-oriented this episode, we've decided to throw me in the hot seat because I'm resident music man, Ewan Gleadow.
Yes.
How are you? You doing well?
Oh, all right. Yeah. I'm very happy to be here talking about music with an expert. I always feel like, when it's about cinema and stuff, I'm like, yeah. I can hold my own. But then when it's time for music talk, I'm like, I'm out of my depth. I need the extra support. I need to be taken care of. I'm a little baby just lost on the shores. It's like, I don't know where to go. And you're the shining light. You're a beacon in the darkness.
When you said expert there, I genuinely thought someone else was joining us. But no, I am the resident expert. I felt myself drift more and more to music over the past year, and that's nothing to do with the financial benefits of doing so and writing about it. But I have done it nonetheless. And today, of course, we are talking about two very distinct works, two very, very big works for the people that like his work, which is the D.A. Pennebecker documentary Don't Look Back, and Bob Dylan's, you can't see I'm doing air quotes, but autobiography, Chronicles Volume 1.
They've started calling you an anarchist. Ooh. The papers, that's the word now.
Anarchist?
Right.
Bravo.
Yeah.
You're kidding. What papers have you seen?
2 or 3. Today, yeah. Just because you don't offer any solution.
You're kidding.
Of course.
Anarchist?
Yeah.
Ugh. Give me a cigarette. Give the anarchist a cigarette. Anarchist. Oh. Singer such as I.
I was a little surprised to see it myself, but there
Well,
you
it
go.
probably took them a while, man, to think of that name. No, they couldn't say communist.
Well, did they say that yesterday?
Communists aren't in this. Communists, in England, communists really aren't.
Oh, it's cool.
Yeah. I don't think it's cool to be an anarchist, though. It's cool.
No, I'm sure.
Remember, it's not. I don't think it is.
How do we even introduce this pairing? Because it's quite, on the surface, it's just a book and a film. It's a documentary on Bob Dylan's tour of the UK, and then the book is just sort of inserts from parts of his life that he was interested in writing about. That is, on the surface, quite easy, but then you remember it's Bob Dylan, and Bob Dylan's to the fans' credit, who admire him and seek him out as a deity of belief, he is very complex. There is more lore to Bob Dylan than there are some fiction novels. So I suppose, the sort of respect and the integrity that surrounds his image, it's huge. You see parts of that in the book and parts of that in the film. We will begin with a comparison briefly of both because it helps us sort of shimmy our way into talking about the book. The last time we did a music episode was Jarvis Cocker, and I remember at the time we ended that and thought there's no real way of knowing more about him as a person, but there is a way of knowing more about him as the artist through the book and the film. Mm-hmm. Do you know any more? Firstly, do you know anything about Bob Dylan before entering into this? And now that you've watched the film and read the book, do you feel like you know any more about Bob Dylan?
I mean, I don't know if I should share this with the listening public and with you. I don't know if it's considered something to be shameful of, but I think the first time I was actually aware of who Bob Dylan was was with Zack Snyder's Watchmen.
I knew that was coming.
Because it opens up, there's great opening scene, and then it's just the intro montage with the times they are changing. I was like, this is a bloody amazing song. I'm loving it. And just reading up reviews when I was younger of the film, circa, let's say, 2011, 2012, when I watched it, everyone was mentioning, like, oh yeah, the best scene in the movie comes very early on. This song by Bob Dylan. I was like, oh yeah, Bob Dylan, this lad. I've heard that name many times. I've probably heard other songs, but it just never really. I never really focused too much on him, but after watching all things, I ended up becoming kind of a fan. A more mainstream fan. Like, I've never been one to listen to an entire record up until very recently in preparation for this podcast. But I've enjoyed quite a few of his songs. I would say probably my favorite. There are quite a few actually that I love, that I listen to many times over, but one of my favorites, it is popular, but still I love Don't Think Twice, one of his earliest ones. But it's so beautiful, so effective. I tried using it in a short film when I was in uni. My professor told me it was too obvious and too well known a song to use. I was like, ah, shit. Okay. And I had to go for something else. But yeah, so I wasn't particularly well versed into Bob Dylan outside of the myth of the man, which is
Yes.
something that's so unique. I mean, we've talked about Jarvis Cocker. I've been on your podcast talking about the Beatles. Like, we're talking about very famous people, especially the Beatles, like probably the most famous band of all time. But there's no real myths behind them. There's always a clear sense of, these are the singers and artists and players, and they just make the music, and they may be beloved, they may be legendary, but they're not mythological. Bob Dylan is a mythological figure. And I think because he reinvented himself so many times, I found myself reading this book, especially Chronicles Volume 1, thinking like, wow, this is so unlike anything I've read, and it all makes sense in its own nonsensical way. It's quite a book.
It is. It's quite the book. And I suppose that's the great benefit of it, isn't it? It's a very broad book, shall we say. It's very unlike the typical autobiographical piece, which is why I did air quotes for a listening audience. Because this, to some degree, is a work of fiction. It is fictional in the sense of mystery. It's a fiction in the sense of there isn't something quite right with some of the placements. Not that it's noticeable. You could say that this is an autobiography to the most passing of fan, and they would say, yeah, sure it is. There are people that doubt the integrity of it as an autobiographical piece, but we will get to that. What I do want to ask, because I'm glad you mentioned using Don't Think Twice in a student film, because the one time, I don't know if you know this, but when I did media studies as an A-level, I actually had to make a short film. So
I did not know this.
I made a trailer for a comedy film called Gangster.
Oh.
It is buried deep away. I have a copy of it, but it is buried so far down in the files on my computer. It's like underneath all the article images and all the PDF files I have of all my work, just crushed down. And for that one, I used Thin Lizzy's Jailbreak song, Boys Are Back in Town, because of course I did. But it reminded me of sort of the integrity of musicianship in film. And we'll focus up in a moment, but it's one of the rare artists that I can think of where you don't really hear their music much in film. I always think of the Beatles as a good example. The only time I've heard them in a film is While My Guitar Gently Weeps in With Nil and I towards the end, and that's just a brief segment. Obviously, Yesterday kind of crushed that, thanks to Danny Boyle's Alone. But Bob Dylan's a very mysterious artist. I think he touched upon that well, where we don't really know about him. And I think that's a very conscious effort. It's a very, very nourished, integral part of his music is that nobody really knows much about him. And even then, he offers personal details in Chronicles. They're written in such a way that it doesn't feel real. And I expect no less from someone that won the Nobel Prize for Literature, which is an incredible stat. I could only wish to do so, but you don't do that when you write about farmers using lasers to stop birds eating their crop.
But you never know. Give it time.
Oh, yeah. That Pulitzer's in the post, I imagine, yeah. No, but I think part of that as well, part of that image and part of that necessity that the fans like about him is the very open way he talks about the creative process, especially in the All Mercy chapter, which is very telling of a mental state that is, I don't want to be here, I don't want to make music.
Hmm.
And suddenly, like that, there is a click. And I want to put this question to you as someone that is a creative and that is someone that is working in creative industries. What did that chapter do for you? Was there a sense of hurt or help that sort of comes from that? You know, it's difficult to see. I mean, obviously, it's quite a popular narrative now that the creative in need of focus and help, and then they get it through some sort of intervention, whether or not they've heard it in a jazz club, as Bob Dylan says he does, or if they're walking down the street and they just observe something. How does that reflect? How does that reflect not only on yourself but on Bob Dylan as an artist?
It's it's very raw and honest in a way that's not necessarily truthful. Like, but in a way, it doesn't really matter. I kind of like that. Bob Dylan kind of loves to. I don't even know how to really put it honestly, because he's such a fascinating individual, such an interesting topic and a great question. But Bob Dylan constantly manages, like, he seems to hate the spotlight. That's how it seems. Like, reading this book, like, it seems like he's not someone who necessarily plays because he loves to do that, but he plays because he has to. It's almost like a physical need. It's almost like he has to eat, he has to breathe, and he has to play music. That's what he does. Doesn't necessarily seem to be loving it per se, even though deep down we all know he is. I mean, come on. Um, but you get to the chapter of Oh Mercy, and it really is this, like, kind of meandering trip through all of his dreams, and like, but basically being burnt out on work and on singing. It's like, we're recording this album, I'm not really feeling it, I'm not feeling the lyrics. We are spending like 2 days trying to record one track when usually it would take like 6 hours. Like, all of that just adds on itself more and more and more. And I'm reading it, I'm like, man, it's unusual for an artist to put themselves in out there in this way. And even though, like, I think the fact that this was set, it actually took place, I mean, in New Orleans, which is also this magical place, this magical city. It manages to create this snapshot of 1989's New Orleans that's, this bustling city for musicians and jazz artists and outcasts a little bit, and he seems to belong to it, and this is loving it, and he's fitting in. I think the moment when he just, I think it's a bit long in general, that chapter. It's probably the longest maybe, um but it kind of fits with the overall, ennui, you could even say, that he's feeling and going through. But the moment when he just listens to that song in this jazzy bar, and just gives him newfound energy. I'm young, I'm still very young, but I've had that feeling like twice so far in my life, creatively speaking. And it's so just reinvigorating. It's a second wind. And you feel like, just reading this chapter, like the way he just goes back at the studio and recording a song, and like, and then he's on his balcony, he just starts playing the guitar, and he completely improvises an entire song. I've written this new lyrics in just one night. Like, he's just exploding now again with newfound passion for music and for creating and for playing. It's deeply inspiring, and very easy to relate to, I think. um yeah.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that. It's I mean, speaking personally on that, I mean, you'll know better than anybody the sort of rises and falls I have with sort of burning out and how much I do.
You and me
And
both, man.
oh man, it's but I think it's very recently that I've sort of hit this creative slaughter.
Hmm.
I'm barreling through everything as fast as I can because I'm just, something's clicked. And it was reading that Bob Dylan book that I was like, oh yeah, that happened to me recently. I don't know what set it off. I think the past two times I've had that feeling, which, is, I've only had that feeling twice, and it's both times been this year. Both of them have not come from a place of anguish, but have actually come from somewhere of real anger, real, not annoyance, but like genuine, not rage, but I think a part of me is annoyed at myself for not doing as much. as I should, and that pushes me further and further and further. So to see that is not an unusual thing, to see that was something that Bob Dylan would go through, to see that was something that creatives would go through, like yourself, is rather reassuring, because I thought I was just going insane. I just thought I'd lost the plot. But it's kind of like, I mean, for about 2 months after work, as soon as I finished work, I would go and lie on my bed, and about 4 hours would pass. I'd have like a nap, and I never nap. If anybody knew me at like uni or like just after it, they would know that I can't sleep through the day.
Yeah.
And now it's just like something I'm fighting against constantly. And it was one day when I was just lying on the bed, something clicked in my brain. It was like, well, this is a waste of time, isn't it? This isn't time you get back. And I think there's a part of that in Dylan's work here that is real, sort of, you've got to grasp the moment, and he does that. He goes back to his hotel. He goes and plays with the Grateful Dead. He does all this remarkable stuff, even after he's done all the remarkable work before. He could live off of that legacy and just tour and continue. There is a fundamental creativity that isn't extinguished throughout. Having said that, I do want to bring up a quote from a Bob Dylan biographer called Clinton Halen,
Okay.
who alleges that apparently he knows Dylan better than himself, because he has alleged that the big chapter on Oh Mercy is, and I quote, a work of fiction, end quote, and that it was inaccurate. Now, to a degree of it being inspiring, I do think there is a little bit of harm done to that if it's not true. We don't know if it's true. This is one word against another. What do you think it does in the sense of making the piece entertaining? Is that sacrifice necessary? You can have that sacrifice. It's kind of like you can have your cake and eat it.
It's something that I was wondering, and that I often wonder whenever it comes to non-fiction in general, even movies, even documentaries, and I always think back to one of my idols, the good Werner Herzog, who oftentimes makes incredibly cinematic documentaries, and he completely embraces the stagey aspect of putting on a documentary, to the point of actually directing people to do things that are just incorrect, knowingly so, but it looks better for the camera. It's great. We're in Antarctica. Yeah, just get close to the ice and you can hear the seal wailing in the distance. It's like you can hear jack shit. You're on top of like 5 meters of thick ice, but it works great in the moment. And I think the same applies to this autobiography, or at least especially to the Oh Mercy chapter, which seems to be kind of the outlier in that sense. I don't know how intentional that was from Dylan's perspective, like how much he just sat down and kind of planned how to structure it to be more engaging, almost like a free act structure, almost like a short story in and of itself. But he manages to make it very entertaining, again, very relatable. It has these ups and downs, highs and lows that lend themselves to storytelling. I think it's for the better, honestly. It doesn't bother me that much. I think anyone that's just looking for downright truth in those things will always end up being disappointed. I think the worst nonfiction works are the ones that are slaves to reality and truth, because it's dull. Real life is not that entertaining. We see it and live it as exciting because we are the protagonists of our stories, but everyone else is boring. Instead, here, if you have Bob Dylan just having weird discussions with a Chinese man and losing himself in the streets of New Orleans, that's a magical quality that's just beautiful to go through. How did you feel about all of this?
Just from what you've said there and what we sort of spoke about with the whole impact it has on the creative process, it's a very, I don't know, I think it doesn't remove anything for me, because at the end of the day it's entertaining, and I find that I'm moved by entertaining stuff. On the other hand, there is sort of a glimmer of, this is just too perfect. This is just too systematic for it to actually be the whole truth. There is, there is that immediate change. There's sort of the adrenaline of, I need to get back and do something. I need a change. On the other hand, it can't have been that easy. It can't. I don't mean to doubt one of the greatest musicians of all time, but I do doubt it a little bit. But I suppose that sort of fictional component is a quite quite a nice change of pace, really, from what we've seen in autobiographies countless times over. I used to before we did this podcast, I would not read, and I've read almost 100 books this year. That's a nice change of pace. Thank you.
Clap.
I mean, you just hit your Goodreads goal today, didn't you?
Yes, I did. 80
yeah.
books. Yeah,
Fantastic.
which is shocking again. Like,
that's fantastic.
Yeah.
I'm like scraping the barrel of stuff. I'm reading The Power of Habit currently, which is actually quite good, but it's just to have a break from fiction, really. But before I started reading properly, like actually engaging in texts that were worth my time, I would read nothing but comedians' autobiographies. That would be it. And that really does shed some light on the whole perspective of autobiographies, is that a bulk of them are really boring. A bulk of them are just horribly dull. Just a list of experiences and a list of downfalls. And they're not that interesting because either the person isn't interesting or there's not enough to warrant an autobiography. Bob Dylan is someone that has lived a life that is worth an autobiography, but still he feels the need to entertain. And I think that's the big, fundamental, very important change for Chronicles, and it's why I kind of like it so much, is that this is, even if it is a work of fiction, the fundamentals, the message is intact. That hasn't changed. What Dylan wants to talk about isn't changed by the perspective of, well, this didn't happen or that didn't happen. And just considering the sort of usual format of an autobiography, the very much, I was born here, then I went to work here, and then I died here. What does it do for you, this narrative style? It's very in the moment. It's very personal. It's. I mean, I say that as if it's not common for an autobiography, but it's rare that you have an emotion attached to memories that are very lived in and throughout an autobiographer. You know, those people have lived it. They've moved on. They're essentially retreading their old moments because that's what sells. With Bob Dylan, there is an entertainment value there that is unexplained, and it's, I don't know, what do you think of that change of pace? It's a very odd one.
Yes, it's refreshingly non-linear, and even then, in its non-linearity, there's a lot of elements that I don't know how cheeky they are, but knowing the character, probably they're very much intended to be so, because it starts off like it doesn't start off with the beginning. It's just kind of like him in New York in 1961, I believe, and then it goes forward in time, and then further forward, like skipping completely most of the late 60s and 70s to go to 1989, only in the final chapter to go back to his origins and beginnings. It feels like he's trying to demythologize himself, to demystify what people think of Bob Dylan, because there's a lot of myths, there's a lot of urban legends essentially about him, and it basically opens up kind of like, this is like no, I wasn't like living on the tracks or whatever bullshit you've read. I wasn't, basically a homeless kid when I was 6. But then the book evolves in a way that makes you go like, a few of the stories might be bullshit, there's like an encounter with gorgeous George that's like, he gave me strength because he told me, it's like, don't stop playing, kid, something like that, to that effect. And you're reading it, it's like, it might be true, it's plausible, but also it's probably just more crap from Bobby D. But it's lovely. It works. Again, I think a mystery is always more interesting than the truth, and especially with someone like Bob Dylan. He's built such a career on just the mystique behind this figure, that if he actually went out there and said exclusively the truth from his point of view, I mean, it might still work probably, but but to an extent, because that's the appeal of him. He's a chameleon, and you feel that in this book. And I love that he's like, nah. You want to know about this year, the making of this album? Fucking cares. Like, those are the biggest ones. You already listen to them. Let's just talk about 3 albums that no one gives a shit about, basically. So I'm just reading it, and I'm like, I don't know this song. Let me listen to that. I don't know this song either. Let me listen to that. It got to a point where, like, with the Oh Mercy part, I was just like, okay, I'm gonna stop it here, listen to the whole album, so I have more context for this chapter, because otherwise I don't know where this is going to end up. So yes, I particularly liked it. probably a bit messy. Like I went into this not knowing much about Bobby Dylan. You were way more familiar with his life story, I guess, right? So was it a bit easier to follow from the get go, or not?
Yes, I think definitely in the sense of, I mean, obviously the Bob Dylan reviews I do are partly because I really am interested in talking about his work, but
Mm.
partly because I know it fares well, and the whole rat race is due to
The SEOs.
viewerships, good old SEO. But something like specifically the All Mercy chapter for me is really interesting because that's a period where Bob Dylan, one, wasn't particularly popular, and two, wasn't particularly good. He'd made 3 albums before that had just flumped. They were failed. They were awful. I don't know how well that comment will go down in the Bob Dylan community, but it's true. And All Mercy was what a lot of people perceive as the beginnings of his comeback, because he did that. All Mercy is a magnificent album. It's really quite wonderful. It's probably the best work he'd done since the mid 70s. So a 15-year gap of like some pretty on and off material. And it was a return to form, essentially. People say that'll be his big grand return, and then the album he followed it up with is awful, Under the Red Sky. But it's a very key moment for him, because I think, fictional or not, there is a truth to his feelings in that moment. There is a truth to how he feels throughout the book, to the early days of recording, where it's kind of, when he gets the record deal and he just says, "Oh, thanks very much," but on the inside his heart's pumping, he's racing, he's excited. There's definitely that feeling with Dylan. You get the sense that he's not. I think a lot of it is about perspective. It's the perspective of who Dylan is and how much he's accomplished. Bob Dylan's accomplished a hell of a lot. That's a lengthy career. To do that much is just impressive. There's few artists that like him, both quality and quantity. The issue is that the fans have a perception of him as being like this massive mystery, this thing to unravel that they need to know. And what I like so much about Chronicles, and especially the fiction aspects of it, it's a rejection of what an autobiography should be, and rightly so, because there is so much more to a piece when you don't really get what they mean or what they're trying to do. All Mercy, for instance, is a wonderful period because it does tie up a couple of loose ends, and it's a very interesting segment. But as far as its accuracy, I don't really mind. I'm not too fussed. It's an entertaining little side piece to what is a very entertaining period. But it definitely helps to have more detail about him if you're going in. I mean, like I'm one of the lucky people that I can't believe I'm not bragged about this yet, but I did get to see him live this year in my favourite place on earth, Hull. He was wonderful, like really, really good. And I'm not just saying that because I forked out £100 on a ticket, but because he was actually very good.
Alive and kicking at 81 years old, basically.
The man can shimmy. He's that is a consistency and a quality that few artists have. Not just that age, but that long ago. His first album was okay. His self-titled one is just some folky tunes to sort of test the waters. But then from there, it's no artist I can think of has had such a long stretch of real classics. And he doesn't really talk about those. He talks about the end of that period with New Morning. He talks about the aftershock of it with All Mercy, when his popularity was probably at an all-time low. He's charting the moments that he wants to re-experience. And I think I've got a lot of respect for any artist that can do that with an autobiography, where it's not talking about the hits. It's the counter to LCD Sound System, who's, the documentary Shut Up and Play the Hits, is give the audience what they want. Bob Dylan is very much a person of give the soul what it wants, because the soul is what will engage the audience. That gig he did in Hull, there was no like a Rolling Stone, there was no Tambourine Man, there was nothing of that caliber. But for the people that have followed Bob Dylan for that long, they've got to understand that it's just, he's there to tour a new album. Most people are there to tour a new album. So to actually reject what people are asking to hear, oh yeah, a couple from the new album, get some classics on for the encore. No. It's a wonderful rejection of what makes music popular. And I cannot respect that more. And I think they do it in such an entertaining way with Chronicles is marvellous. But Chronicles is a very reflective piece. And the documentary from D.A. Penbecker, I think I'm pronouncing his name right. To be honest, I didn't check. I'm going off of my memory alone.
It
That
sounds
is
about
not.
right. Yeah.
It sounds about right. Yeah, it's that finds Dylan at the time period that he doesn't talk about in his book, which is I believe it's 64, 65 when he was touring England.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
which I mean, first off, what do you think of the documentary, just as a whole, as a piece of entertainment, as a piece of art? What were your thoughts?
Love it. Amazing, amazing stuff. I loved Don't Look Back. Um, we had this exact conversation back when we did the episode on pulp. We were like, this
Yes.
this is such an interesting subject, and the documentary is the most. I want to say banal because at the end of the day, like the more interesting part of the pulp documentary was the fans, was the people of the city where pulp grew up in, being interviewed, talking about the legacy and the influence of this band on them. Because everything with the band, there's just so little of it, so little of it is interesting or fun, which is a disappointment. Don't Look Back is the full package.
Yes.
You get not only a great perspective from fans, general public, journalists on the way that they look at Bob Dylan, but you also get to become a bit more intimate with him and his entourage during his stay in England and the whole tour without losing the mystique of Bob Dylan. And it humanizes him so much, so much in a way that I don't know. I've seen very few music documentaries ever accomplish. I thought it was spectacularly well done. Like it's an hour and 40 minutes long, 96 minutes long, whatever. Like it, oof, man, just flies completely quickly. Um, it balances out, long sections of just talking with concert scenes. There is a rhythm to the way these musical moments are assembled as well that gives you a sense of the passage of time and of how boring it must be as well. Like by the sixth time you hear the times they are changing, it's like shit, man. Woo, woo. That's what it's like what you were saying earlier. Like that's what everyone wants to hear, and he has to give it to them because back then he was kind of forced to do it. It was the new big hit song from him. So I there's a lot in here to unpack, and I thought it was a magnificent experience.
It is. It is a magnificent experience, and I think for me personally as well, it's kind of like the tour in England. Obviously, I'm from England, unfortunately, so it's kind of got a nice connection to me. Where he's played venues that I've been to now.
Oh,
The
nice.
one in Newcastle, for instance. Like he played St James's Park, which is the football stadium for Newcastle United, up the Magpies, etc. He played places that I've been to that are kind of just in the background of my everyday life, which is a weird feeling. And I get that feeling with very few musicians. It's kind of like, oh, Bob Dylan's been there. Strange, that one. And it's just very few artists have that effect on me. I mean, we had that experience a couple of times in Venice at the film festival. Very stoic for most of it, and then I see Steve Buscemi and melt like an ice lolly in the sun.
Takes very little.
It does take I mean, it takes Randall from Monsters Inc. to melt my heart. As far as far as as far as Bob Dylan goes, I absolutely adore this documentary. I think this is primarily one of the reasons I recommended we do this podcast episode, is to essentially make you watch this film.
Thank you so much.
I got it. It's not a problem. I got it on. It was one of the first Criterions I ever bought.
Oh,
I say
nice.
bought. I got it for Christmas. I got that and Night of the Living Dead, which is a wonderful pairing. Back to back is delightful.
Wow.
For a lot of reasons, this documentary is essentially the quintessential and only documentary that really gets Dylan at this period in time, because the cameras are following him. He hadn't yet developed an aversion to the press. Well, he has, but I mean that's shown in the documentary, but and quite brilliantly. I guess I have to speak on this because I'm a journalist, but I completely agree with his stance on the press. Just the lack of care for interviews. I love interviewing artists and filmmakers and wrestlers and all these people I admire and have respect for. There is nothing I respect more than just a blunt and blanket refusal to speak to anyone.
It's an iconic moment right there. The entire sequence.
that it's a wonderful sequence because it does highlight kind of the issues that Bob Dylan would often face, and I think that's one of the, just to throw it back to when we were talking about sort of the mystical image that surrounds Bob Dylan. That is one of the key things for him, is that the press got bored of him because they wouldn't be able to speak to him. They didn't have access. They had the same access that the people reading the paper would have, and the people reading it probably knew more than the people writing it. I do love, though, those little throwaway clips where there's the guy in the phone booth essentially writing his review on the phone and talking it over. It's just a very nice time capsule of something I will never experience because we all have phones that can type these days. But there was a forbidden nostalgia that I don't have for that, seeing the structure of it. It reminded me of Roger Ebert when he would, phone in his reviews from Cannes. As far as the documentary goes in showing Bob Dylan, it's a very, very integral piece to understanding not just his motives, but his entourage of the time. You can see Joan Baez, you can see Allen Ginsberg.
The Queen.
You can see
There's the Queen.
the Queen. You say that, but Marianne Faithfull's there, who's the real surprise. There are people in there that just kind of show up and aren't really credited. They're just in the background. People like John Mayall. They can all be spotted. Do you think that gives this documentary, obviously it's made of the time, it's made in the mid-60s, but do you think the sightings of people like Joan Baez, like Marianne Faithfull, does that give it a presence that would not be felt in something like Martin Scorsese's No Direction Home, for instance, or the Rolling Thunder Review, which is looking back on footage of the time? There's a perspective change where it's, you can look back or you don't look back. There we go. Got that one in. No, but seriously, it's I've thrown myself off with that pun. Pennebaker has the very, very delicate beauty of actually being there in the moment and making something out of that. Everybody else is having to reflect on it and look back. Do you think that perspective change is the key to Don't Look Back?
Yes, there's always a sense of immediacy when you're the one actually recording basically history happening and not knowing that it's going to become historical. Like, I didn't even realize there's one moment that I've seen many times over the years when people talk about, the beginning of fandom and the obsession with celebrities and stuff. I've seen that clip of the young girls, which is like 3 or 4 girls waiting outside of the hotel where Bob Dylan is staying, just kind of like adoringly waiting for him. Oh, he's at the window. Oh, further up. Oh, Bob, Bob. Oh, I'm so shy. I looked at me. Like, it's so cute. It's so innocent in a way. But you can see just the birth of something terrible. And even in the same
Yes.
documentary, you see how it starts off. The first few days, it's just standing in the hotel, and there's just barely anyone outside waiting for him because he's not a niche sensation, but not that many people know he's there. And after a couple concerts, there are people literally clinging to his car as he's leaving the venue. It's crazy. It's disturbing. And the best thing about it is that Panabaker's just shooting all of this, just kind of like going and rolling with the punches. Um, it's I've not been able. I wanted to try and watch at least one of the Scorsese documentaries because I've not seen them yet. I didn't manage to find the time, but I will see them in the
They're
future.
very
because
long.
They're very long. That's why I was
They're
like,
very long.
oh, yeah, this is on Netflix. Fuck, over 3 hours. No, Marty, I love you, but please, we can think of people's time. Um, but still, I agree what you're saying. Like, it is a completely different perspective. I've seen other documentaries that are, look, the bands and the artists looking back on their career or specific
Yeah.
times. Sure, it's interesting, but I don't know if those documentaries would have moments like John Baez playing the guitar and singing, and Bob Dylan using a typewriter, typing at the rhythm of the song. I was just watching it. I was like, oh, I can watch like half an hour of this. Like, don't cut, just keep it going. And it goes on for a good like 5 minutes, I think, that entire
Yeah.
sequence. Like, it's filled with moments that probably back then it was more of like, you see an exclusive look at celebrities, what they do behind doors, even though these celebrities are anti-cultural, going against the grain and against the and breaking the mold. People like Baez, like Dylan, but now it feels even more like the time capsule and like not even just time capsule, but I think in general, just the power of the moving image, more so than just photography, is that it renders people and moments immortal. And to know that that moment and so many other in this documentary will not be lost, well, hopefully, will not be lost by time. It's magical. It's absolutely magical. Something so genuine, so spontaneous. I can honestly see someone like, I don't know if Scorsese ever tackles this period, whatever, but like someone making a documentary on Bob Dylan, so many of those little touches and those little moments will probably be like, I wouldn't really need it to move the story forward, to look at him as the artist and the person, whatever, voiceover on top of it. No, no, no. Great direction, honestly. Yeah.
I suppose the big similarity is that, you know, Chronicles is sort of very unique. It's very fluid. It's very ambiguous at times.
Mm.
And even with Pennebaker, he's just rolling with the punches. There is even though Dylan is reflecting in his book and Pennebaker is in the moment, there is a symmetry in the sense that they're quite unique. They're quite unlike anything that we've seen in that particular genre. You know, you think of all the musical biopics, for instance. I mean, we'll have to go down that rabbit hole briefly because we did the same for autobiographies. The amount of musical biographies that have talking heads of vaguely famous people that kind of were around for the band or are just on hand to talk about them is really just grating. It's terrible.
Mhm.
Now, the benefit that Martin Scorsese has is that Bob Dylan actually agreed to do an interview for the Rolling Thunder Review, which he adds as little as you'd expect for a man whose reputation is mysterious. So it's a fact of the matter is that, like you said, you put it brilliantly, he's rolling with the punches. There is no way of knowing where it's going. And I think that's where the best of documentaries come. I think it's where the best of literature comes from. The amount of success stories that have come through sheer grit and determination that look like they're going to fail. You know, one of my favourite books is All the President's Men. Never at any point in that book until the very final article is submitted on the Nixon scandal and Watergate do you think that it could have happened. To experience that at the time is to experience something like Don't Look Back. It's the revelation of a musical artist growing in front of you. It's a time capsule piece, but in all the right ways. And at times, this feels like a blur of, like you said when we started discussing this, the musical numbers. You know, he does Time Zero Change and the likes, and you know, there's nice concert footage, there's nice bits and pieces. How does that feel to witness? There is that blur of concert and artist, which is what we saw in years and years later with Cult's documentary.
Yeah.
I assume it fares better here.
Just a
Do
little
you think
bit.
just a smidge, not to slander Florian Habich, but how do you think that sort of splicing, that editing process of behind the scenes, he's clacking away on a typewriter with Joan Baez on guitar, to actually being on the stage, being mobbed by the fans, what does that cohesion do for the documentary itself?
It feels less like glorifying the concert aspect of such a documentary, which you always have. You know, there are so many of these that are just 15-20 minutes of just raw footage of someone singing on stage and whatever. Like, I like concert films. There are some that I love, but I do like the extra. You know, I like how everything balances out in here, so it doesn't make any section particularly tiring. But especially the concerts, again, rolling with the punches, unpredictability. There's this one concert where he goes to where the microphone is not working as soon as he starts singing. It's like, ah, shit. It almost lulls you into this sense of safety because, you know, he's going to another concert now. He's going to start with times they are changing and whatnot. And instead, nope. There's like a little problem. The wrench stopping everything. Fuck. So it keeps it fresh, it keeps it interesting, and you're always pretty much always seeing it from behind the scenes. And even the moments where you are in the crowd, it's a tripod shot, lockdown camera from far away, and it's just the one. You don't have 15 to 20 like fancy shots, the one on top and the one on the ground and the cameraman on stage. So it makes it feel more intimate as well. And there are those moments that are particularly daunting, or just Bob Dylan kind of going like, the lights are turned off. Okay, I cannot see the audience. Okay. And he just goes and sings to basically darkness, this pitch black emptiness, and you get the feeling of just how, well, I don't want to say scary per se, but it ain't easy. It must not be easy to go out there, even if you're someone as carefree as Bob Dylan, to just sing every time in front of hundreds, if not thousands, of people in some of these places, and you cannot even see them. But thankfully, they applaud every 2 minutes, so it's already, they're there and alive and everything.
That applause that they do after like every song, that is something that has stayed. That is something that still happens.
I
The man
recognize
could-
this.
even
Shut
then,
up.
I
Let
think-
him play.
at that stage in your career, it's nice to get applause. But after getting applause for every single song, it must get a bit boring,
Probably,
But
yeah.
I think it is the quintessential documentary piece. I can't think of many better. I can't think of many documentaries that are better in the sense of music.
Mm.
It'll always remind me of LCD Sound System again, to bring it up, that Shut Up and Play the Hits, which is essentially the day before the concert, the day after, which is spliced so nicely. It kind of feels a bit like Chronicles, where it's James Murphy, the lead singer, sat around in his apartment the day after, just recovering from what was a 4-hour set in Madison Square Garden. He's doing very routine, mundane things. He's walking his dog, he's having a coffee, he's visiting offices now that it's all finished, and he's coming to terms with it. And to splice that in with a moment that ended his career for about 6 years, and then they got back together. But that's beside the point. It's a wonderful thing to experience and to see, and to get a peek behind the curtain of any artist is interesting. It's such a fundamentally flawed arena for directors, though, because a lot of them are stunned. They're starstruck. It's like, oh my god, I'm with Bob Dylan. What do I do? Just point the camera at him. And there's a nice sort of, not amateurish feel, but there is a very intimate feeling to a lot of Pennebaker's work here, where it's in the hotel before. You just sat around, they're talking. They're not really talking about anything, but the discussion and the sort of the people involved in the discussion have such a high public persona. They have such a high regard in communities, and rightly so for the work they've done. But I wonder how much that affects the overall experience. I wonder how much that, that legendary status given to the people of the 60s, that new movement that came through with the likes of Andy Warhol, Leonard Cohen, that movement is integral. But I wonder how much of that respect will be lost in the next 10 to 20 years when my generation and your generation, we're the same generation. I don't know why I separated those. We're not that old.
Not
But
yet.
I wonder if that reverence will be passed on to people that we listen to now that are kind of 20 years younger than Bob Dylan. People like Nick Cave, people like Jarvis Cocker, people like, even, I mean, it's mad to say it now, but in 20 years' time, this will be the sort of anticipation people have for the likes of Taylor Swift, the likes of Selena Gomez, the likes of Chris Pratt. These are people that are working popular works.
You say Chris Pratt?
I did say Chris Pratt. It's
Is-
unfortunate, but it's
Is it that
true.
Chris Pratt singer that I don't know of, or is talking about
No,
the
I'm
same
talking about Chris Pratt, the actor.
Star-Lord?
I think this can be applied to acting too. He's a great singer. He did that on Parks and Rec.
That's true, I guess.
Johnny Karate slander on this podcast. I would never.
Parks and Rec is good. It's very good.
It is. But there is a sort of feeling there that respect that is garnered for Bob Dylan isn't something that's exclusive to his generation. There is the next layer of artists to start respecting. Who that is, I don't know. I'd hazard guesses, but I'd feel like
beats
that's
me.
rude.
I think that's kind of the fun thing of looking back at documentaries like this, because now they're legends. People like Bob Dylan and the Beatles and, I don't know, Rolling Stones and all those proper icons of music and of multiple generations. But we were born with them being famous. Like, it's kind of the same thing as growing up now and probably having, people like Timothée Chalamet, who, fun fact, said that his favorite book that he read this year is Chronicles Volume 1. I was watching interviews of Bones and all, and they asked him favorite book this year. He was like, "Yeah, I reread Chronicles Volume 1. I love that." Which is like,
Don't
shit.
spur
That's
him
such.
on. because you know for a fact, and I know for a fact, that he has a vague resemblance to Bob Dylan in the 60s, and you know for a fact that if they do another biopic, what kind of a
Hey,
biopic, then it's going to be him.
you know it's coming. It's probably just doing research now, yeah?
It's going
Give
to
it
be
two,
after
3 years.
Wonka, surely.
After Wonka, they'll be like, yeah, look at that. Willy Wonka singing Bob Dylan, basically. You know?
Horrifying.
Um, but but yeah, the jokes aside, you yeah, I agree. I don't know who's going to become a legend of this caliber in 10, 15 years, 15, 20, 30 years, um, like Bob Dylan, because we're just seeing them grow up now. Um, but again, like, means are different as well. Watching a concert
Yeah.
back then was different from watching a concert now, and moving around the world and all that. So the world has changed. The times were changing in '67, and they're still a changing now in 2022.
That's the thing. There's a reverence to Bob Dylan that is usually reserved for the dead.
Yes, yes. He always feels there's like a very select few number of celebrities, and not even just celebrities, just icons. I
Yeah.
don't remember where I heard this conversation because I listen to too many podcasts now. Maybe we had this conversation. I honestly don't know, but just Bob Dylan is the type of person that. Oh yes, he was on an episode of Uncut Gems. Actually, I just remember now. I connected all the dots. But like, he is, he symbolizes just the singer-songwriter.
Yes. Yeah.
He's just, he's someone you put on a t-shirt for normal people to buy. It's like I said earlier, like I was 12, 13. I knew who Bob Dylan was in a very generic way. It's someone that you know of, even if you haven't necessarily listened to any of his albums or actually cared about any of his songs.
Yeah.
It just transcends the medium in a way
He
that,
does. Yeah.
yeah.
It's a transcendence that has also managed to avoid the sort of commercialism of it. I think that is
Mm,
because it's a generational thing. The commercialism of people like Miley Cyrus, who I'm not saying is a good or bad artist. I'm saying that their output is. I know Miley Cyrus more for her presence in the real world, the Wrecking Ball video, rather than the songs,
yes.
the albums, the art that she makes. Is that with Bob Dylan? If he was that famous now, there would absolutely be another degree of that. But I think because he's not a private person, but he's just so difficult to grasp because he's revealing all the right things. You can never get a
Hmm.
jigsaw assembled, and it's surreal. It really is. It's really amazing that he's managed such a lengthy career without actually having someone depict him, even himself. He's not sort of showcased who he is. I mean, the closest we've got is that I'm Not There, which is delightful. I was wondering what you thought of that actually, because I did see you tweet about it.
Yes, I love this. This was a rewatch actually because I knew
Yeah,
um, we were talking about Bob Dylan, and I thought like, man, I know this is not an adaptation per se of a specific time or place with Bob Dylan, but again, it kind of goes back to what we talked about with Paul. And I think I said it at the end of the episode. I was like, like one of my favorite musical biopics is I'm Not There, and it's probably the most unconventional one I've watched. And I love it precisely for that. I love how Todd Haynes just kind of does what Chronicles did in the sense of taking these different snapshots of Bob Dylan's life, giving him a different name, adding wildly just unique and original fictional elements to each of them. Like, a love interest that never existed. Like, for instance, like the Charlotte Gainsbourg character. She's in it. She's the French wife of Bob Dylan. He's never been married to a French woman, but she is connected, and things that happen in that storyline between her and Heath Ledger's Bob Dylan, are connected to things that actually happened with that. And I like how there are all these different styles, cinematic styles. Um, we didn't touch on it earlier, but actually, I think the second or third time I became more interested in Bob Dylan was after watching Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, the Sam Peckinpah movie, where he's actually acting in it. I don't know how you feel about his acting in the film. It's not the greatest. It's not.
yeah,
Uh,
it's there,
it is
certainly.
there, but it is a
Yeah,
great film, and the soundtrack actually contributed to. I would say all of it. definitely like 90% of it is just
He
Bob
did the
Dylan.
bulk of it. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's
Um,
horrifying it might be to learn this, but he has acted again in an
yeah.
actual film, Masked and Anonymous, which
Mm,
is, you know, film. I've not
okay.
seen it. It's not got the best review scale. Out of the two friends that I've seen rate it, one of them has given it 1.5 stars, and the other one has given it
Oh,
5 stars. So I
okay.
really don't know what to think.
Let's say
Um,
divisive. Let's call it divisive then.
I think collectively, though, the book, the documentary, and the film, it's uncovering the persona of Bob Dylan. I think that's the key difference, is that this
Hmm.
is a persona of an artist. People put on stage names. Bob Dylan is a stage name. Richard Hawley is a stage name. The likes of most artists use stage names, you know. What it means for certain artists is different. It's different along the way. And I don't think anybody will know why Bob Dylan decided on Bob Dylan. I don't think anybody knows, because it's always going to be a projection. Oh, what's Bob Dylan think of this? It's not even, that's not his name. It's not him. It's all smoke and mirrors. And I think that's wonderful, that especially now in an era where we can uncover even the greatest of shit posters. I remember when Drill on Twitter was uncovered and everybody collectively decided they just didn't care. Bob Dylan has managed to come through unscathed, which is brilliant, which is phenomenal, and it lends itself to the integrity of his work,
Yeah.
which is displayed quite well in Chronicles and in what do you call it? Don't Look Back.
Don't look back.
Yeah, that's the one. Don't Look Back is an ironic title for a man that spent 300 pages looking back, but we will let him off the hook. We will allow it, because it is high time we answered the big question, isn't it?
Yes.
What, in your opinion, Nicholas, is the the best of the two? Is it the book written by Bobby D himself in his mid-60s, or is it the film, which was made in the mid-60s?
I'll probably go with the film, with the documentary. Don't look back
Mm,
with this, mainly
okay.
because I it's more of a personal thing in that sense. But there were a couple stretches of Chronicles where it was kind of like I don't know. I'm losing focus. I'm
Yeah.
losing attention. Um, it's he manages to make it very entertaining, the best he can, but I do still think that it's more geared towards someone who actually knows that much about him and cares to learn more about some of the ins and outs. Not having grown up or even more recently listened to his albums, you do get to a point where it's just like, I don't know, 10, 15 straight pages through some chapters of just, we were recording this song and there's the bass, the sound, and then we just start thinking, and we come back the second day, and then I was on the balcony and started playing the guitar, and we had this bit. It's like, okay, if I had context for it, or if I was passionate about that song, it would hit much harder. So that element kind of, I don't know about the book. I really liked it, but it kept me from truly loving it. Meanwhile, the documentary I loved every second of it. One of the best documentaries I've seen this year. Might indeed be, like you said, the best music documentary because it's of its time. I'm super curious actually in watching Monterey Pop. I know it's another documentary that Pennebaker made. I don't know if you've watched that one, Ewan, yet.
I
Um,
haven't, no, because I'm terrible for keeping track of things.
it's
But
too much to
no,
watch.
that one does look pretty. There's too much things.
But yeah, yeah. I mean, I'm curious to watch that concert film. But yes, personally, I like to go with the documentary. How about you, man?
Well, I will go the other end just for the sake of variance. I do love the documentary. I love it dearly. I think it's probably the best Criterion I own aside from True Stories. It's a wonderful
Oh.
documentary, like stunning. But I'll go with the book mainly for the reasons that you've just cited. There is that it's a book for the people that want to know more about Dylan, or have convinced themselves into wanting to know more about Dylan and actually just want a pretty decent quasi
Yeah.
biography fiction type thing. I've never stumbled over a word that badly before. That was something else. Autobiographical. There we go. You can just edit that over, can't you? Yeah, no worries.
I can.
No, I think it's very good from the perspective of it's answered a lot of the questions that I had about periods that Dylan is kind of, struggling with. I'd always thought what's gone wrong at a period where his artistic output wasn't the best, because you can kind of chart Dylan from what he's experiencing. I think that big bulk of the 60s where he's just, there was times when he was doing 2 albums a year, and those 2 albums were like regarded as the greatest of all time. Sincerely, one of the workhorses of his generation. He's like me, but for music. The 70s was a lot more laid back. It was a lot more experimental. It was interesting. It was still that same quality, but the cracks are beginning to show by the end of that century. He's done 3 religious-themed records, which isn't a bad thing, with a Slow Train Coming still very good. And there's something after that. He just stops. He stops making material like that. And I do think it comes back to a quote from Bob Dylan, is that he could not write the same music he wrote when he was 27. Something just changes. Something clicks in your brain, whether it's experience, whether it's endeavours that have, interested him elsewhere. It might be a lack of interest. Something changes, and I think Chronicles does a really good job of adapting that. I think it does a really good job of charting his influences at the start of his career and moves it to what he was then doing. He talks about touring with Tom Petty. He talks about having a meal with Johnny Cash and Chris Christopherson. Name dropping, not for the sake of it, but to sort of chart where he's at musically. To have a meal with Johnny Cash and Chris Christopherson is different company to touring with the Grateful Dead, which is, by all means, allegedly a very good live album. I've not listened to it yet. But I think the book does well to chart the behind-the-scenes, almost fictional or not. It gives good perspective of a very strange period for Bob Dylan.
Amen to that.
Lovely stuff, innit? I suppose I should round it out with that outro we do. Clutching at straws. Oh yeah. Go and give us a follow on Twitter, and the other stuff. What, Instagram?
Does he remember the handles? Does he remember the handles?
TikTok. I know the handles. It's at Death Adaptation.
Yes.
Which I have not just looked up there. At Death Adaptation on Twitter, and if you want to give me a follow, you can get me on Twitter as well, at Ewan Gleadow, EWANGLEADOW. You can get my letterbox there, and then my letterbox has a link of all the lovely places I write for. Newcastle World, Cult Following, Daily Star, Clapper, etc., etc., etc. I will not bore you.
The quality writing.
The quality writing of a man that's about to have his 3rd coffee of the day and rattle out a review of Metallica's new song. Wonderful. Where can the good people find you, Nicholas?
They can find me at Nicholas Grasso 90. It's NickyGra97 on Twitter and Instagram. There's links to everything, Letterboxd, my Clapper reviews, my Cult Following reviews as well. I'm in my Linktree now. YouTube videos, short films, everything that I do is on there. And of course, this episode is coming out mid-December, penultimate episode of the year. If you want to hear me talk here with the good Ewan Gleadow about a bit about a contemporary of Bobby D, the good and lovely John Baez, there's a new episode of his dropping of his podcast. Don't listen to this pod, dropping in just 3-4 days, I believe. So go check it out. Follow his Twitter page so that you don't miss any of those lovely episodes if you're a musician or a fan of music in general. And stay tuned, because
Thanks.
in 2
Thanks
weeks...
for plugging that. I forgot about that.
Of course. It's important.
Thanks for doing my job.
But also stay tuned, because in 2 weeks' time, we're closing off the year. And as is tradition, we're talking about a Christmassy themed movie. We're actually doing kind of a double feature, but the first episode of 2023 will also be Christmas themed. So stay tuned, because in 2 weeks' time, we will be joined by the lovely Carson Timar of Clappercast to talk about Eyes Wide Shut, the Stanley Kubrick film, and Traumnovelle, aka Dream Story, by August Schnitzler, which is based on it. And then...
that was a pain to torrent. I mean, purchased legally.
To find in my local bookshop. And
I'm still mourning my local bookshop, Z-Lib, shutting down.
It's the best library.
Can't believe it.
And also, of course, at the beginning of 2023, we will be opening this new season of Death by Adaptation. We're talking about Die Hard. So stay tuned for that as well. Lots of lovely, lovely stuff coming your way. Thank you for listening. Thank you, Ewan, for hosting this one. We hope you all had a fabulous time, and we hope you enjoy coming back for more. Bye-bye.
You'd better. Oh, bye as well, also, yes.